Right. Well, thank you. And my name is Diana Kwan. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm here today with Daniel Hawkins, the CEO of Avail. So Daniel, why don't you start by walking us through your business model and telling us a little bit about how your company is bringing telemedicine to the OR?
Sure, Diana, thanks very much for having me today. So our technology is fundamentally designed to enable medical device industry representatives, field representatives, or remote medical educators to be in an operating room supporting a procedure or transferring technical or clinical knowledge without the requirement of having to physically be in the room. That requirement has, in many respects, plagued the industry for decades and is a limiter with respect to technique adoption and new technology adoption. It's also a limiter from the standpoint of access to clinical knowledge. Prior to the pandemic, we launched this technology with an intent of returning that access and removing those barriers. And of course, the pandemic has heightened that. Our technology is fundamentally built on the notion that there's a console of sorts that has cameras and speaker microphone arrays that acquire images and sound from an operating room, and that is remotely transmitted to somebody who has securely logged on using either an app or through our internet-based portal, and have an opportunity then to interact directly with the staff in a procedure room. They can control cameras, control diagnostic imaging views, and everything they see remotely is displayed on a screen that is integrated into our consoles. So in some respects, it is a self-contained unit that sits next to the operating table. That allows the remote person a full interaction capability, and they can then, of course, control the whiteboard, if you will, and interact directly with the treating physician. From a business model standpoint, we place our units in procedure rooms or in provider facilities without charging for the hardware. That's a bit of a unique angle there. And of course, it has, from a company perspective, lots of dynamics that come from it. We actually generate our revenues from time-based access for the remote user to be able to access a console in a procedure room. And that time-based access should be thought of in some respects like a prepaid cell phone.
So can you tell us at all like how much it would cost for users to use this technology and who you expect will be able to afford it?
Sure. So it's really designed with the intent of being affordable by really anybody who wants to be able to use it and can benefit from it. If we needed to charge for the hardware, it would be haltingly expensive and very restrictive. Frankly, on a time basis, it allows us a chance to disseminate the power of this technology across the industry. In terms of cost, it depends entirely on how many minutes are used, if you will. So one should think of this as stair-stepped pricing, much like you would have with, again, prepaid cell phones. If you commit to 2,000 minutes, there's a certain price. If on a prepaid cell phone, if you commit to 500 minutes, it's higher per minute. We run the same model. So that's a bit of a tough question to answer with respect to exactly how much it would cost, because it depends on the type of purchase plan somebody uses. But one should think of participation in a procedure being a fraction of what it would cost for the travel and logistics, even local travel and logistics, to have somebody there physically. We target our pricing to be considerably under what that would otherwise cost.
And while we're on the topic of costs, you mentioned earlier that the equipment that hospitals need to use the system is expensive, and your company plans to cover those. Given those large costs involved with setting those up, how long do you expect it'll be before you start turning a profit?
So we anticipate it'll be a measure of time, right? It's not going to be next quarter or next month or even next year. I have the benefit of having investors that have a very long-term view and see this as an industry shifting opportunity. I can't disclose some of the specifics, but we're in process right now with a quite significant financing that will accelerate our growth and provide really all the capital necessary to be able to achieve our goals over the next couple of years. We do not anticipate there'll be any issue with respect to financing And from a standpoint of profitability, as you might imagine, each one of these will generate, each console placed will generate a certain amount of procedural activity. Over time, each one placed adds to the value of the network. As the network gets larger, then there will be more reasons to interact with the network, and we will continue to propagate. So we anticipate a bit of a tapered start and a steep incline in revenues that is typical with network-based applications.
Right. And when we're on the topic of investors, Avail raised $25 million in the Series A financing round earlier this year. Can you tell us a little bit about, the investors and perhaps the role the pandemic has played in, driving people's interest in investing in your technology?
Sure. So the technology was originally funded by an institutional investor by the name of Lux Capital. Lux is a prolific investor in transformative technologies and new industry creation. In healthcare, their most recent investment was in a company called Auris Health, which is a next generation surgical robotics company that was recently acquired by Johnson & Johnson. The founder of Auris Health is a man by the name of Fred Moll. Fred and I have known each other for quite a number of years. I was involved with his first robotic surgery effort, a company called Intuitive Surgical. Fred actually was one of the seed investors in Avail, as were a number of other folks in and around my last company, which is a company called Shockwave Medical. A number of the folks involved in that company have invested also in Avail in the early days. The first institutional, again, was Lux Capital. Around that same time period, we received some investment capital from Baidu Ventures, from Refractor Capital, from Playground Global, and from the family fund associated with the founder of Salesforce, Mark Benioff. Our most recent financing that closed in February was what we describe as an A1, and that was led by a group called Co2 Management, a multi-billion-dollar fund out of New York with offices also in the Bay Area, and another smaller fund called Sonder Capital that is actually a fund that was started by Fred Moll. Another one of our investors and board members, a man by the name of Jay Watkins, who is a long-term veteran of the medical device space, and former founding partner at De Novo Ventures. And then again, some other people from Shockwave, folks who invested in my last company, Shockwave, which went public last year.
And what about, this role of the pandemic? Do you think that's, increased investors' interest further?
Very much so. Very much so.
Okay.
Our fundamental business model prior to the pandemic was really, as mentioned, focused on this notion that it's very challenging and access limiting to manage through the requirements of physically being in a procedure room. In order to be able to launch a new medical technology, a Medtronic or a Johnson & Johnson or a Boston Scientific needs to send clinical representatives or sales representatives into a procedure room to be able to train a physician. Then after the first procedure, they need to do 5 or 6 more, and then they need to do that with all of the partners of that physician, and then they can go on to the next hospital. As you might imagine, that limits the capability to, or the speed of a launch. The same is true for new medical techniques, and the challenges associated with that are very material. Our technology is designed to enable a sales representative or a training physician to not have to take a half a day, 3/4 of a day in logistics and actual procedure support to be able to support a physician for 2 or 3 cases. In fact, if each case is 45 minutes, they ought to be able to do that remotely through our system and support them and train them on new techniques and technologies without the requirement of physically being in a room. What is little known is actually over half of the field representative's time, meaning sales or clinical specialists, field technical support time for the medical device industry is spent in logistics going to and from procedure rooms. We've eliminated that with our technology. The same holds true for one physician training another physician. Prior to availability of our technology, there's a requirement for a physician in Los Angeles that needs to be trained by a physician that happens to be in Chicago,
Right.
the one in Chicago has to leave their practice, fly there, and be there for 2 or 3 cases and fly back. They lose 2 days out of their practice. That can be handled instead in 90 to 120 minutes using the Avail system.
Mm-hmm. In terms of perhaps the benefits of being there in person, like what happens, for example, if there's some kind of technical glitch in the software or hardware? Like, is there a backup plan for that kind of thing?
So clearly one of the things we need to do in designing our system, and the reason why we were stealth since 2017 when the company got started, is we were actually solving for exactly that problem. We have 99.9 uptime and have redundancies built in our system to minimize any chance that that would end up happening. And frankly, one of the one of the highest potential risks, I should say, is around network challenges. So networks either at the hospital or on the remote end. We've built redundancies in our software and testing capability, real-time testing capability for signal strength within our software. And we will modulate access to resolution or certain types of potentially unnecessary features to be able to manage through fluctuations in bandwidth. A potentially unnecessary thing that, by way of example, eats a lot of bandwidth is our system displays a tiny picture of the remote user in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen.
Okay.
That's not terribly necessary if you're trying to get a procedure done and you have lousy bandwidth. So we might make that black for a little while. And then bring it back when the bandwidth comes back again. So our software is really designed to be able to deal with all of that. And we, again, have built 99.9 uptime to avoid those risks.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of, again, on a similar topic, like some procedures, like things like an artificial heart transplant, are simply too complex to forgo having someone in the room. I wonder, in what areas would you say it remains a challenge to, implement this kind of digital technology?
So it's all based on the comfort level of those involved. There isn't any particular reason you couldn't do an artificial heart implant with this technology from an Avail technical perspective, but it's all about the comfort level. I've been in med tech for 26 years. I'm the son of a physician. There's a threshold, right? And that threshold would say to me, I'd really rather you not rely on our technology for an artificial heart implantation, for the simple reason that that's complicated enough, acute enough, intense enough that if you want to try that, try it first with somebody in the room 3 or 4 times, get used to it. And then if you decide not to do it with somebody in the room any longer, then do it remotely. We actually candidly had a senior executive at one of the medical device companies ask me if I thought that was reasonable. And my response was, I hadn't thought of that. That one sounds a little tough. I haven't been in one of those procedures. I have watched some of the videos and they're very, very complicated and very involved. I would only recommend doing that after everybody's comfortable. In the way we have gotten folks comfortable, not only in the hospital, but also remotely, is to have somebody redundantly in the room and somebody redundantly remote so that everybody feels that they're getting the full experience they need. And then you remove the person in the room. That's been done for many other intracardiac procedures that folks initially said, hey, we probably ought not to do that with the Avail system. Well, now they're getting done regularly.
And what about privacy? So data privacy is, one of the most often cited concerns when it comes to telemedicine. How do you plan to protect patient data both during a procedure and afterwards?
So there's a variety of different ways to do that. We do end-to-end encryption, 256-bit encryption that is industry standard. Our system is built, frankly, on a platform that protects every possible angle on patient data. It's also important to note that we do not interface with the electronic health record or EHR. We do not interface at all. One should be thinking about us as a telecommunications network in the operating room. So we're in many respects an audio video acquire and transmit technology. We also don't record. And if we don't record anything, then everything on our system is transient. Having said that, we operate our system from the standpoint of security and HIPAA compliance as if we do. So we put a very high threshold on that. That's another reason why we were frankly stealth for 2.5 years before we poked our head out and showed ourselves to the market. We spent a lot of time being quite certain of that, Diana.
Right, right. And so another thing I wanted to ask about, in addition to bringing device representatives into the OR digitally, your company has talked about plans to apply this technology to medical education.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about how you plan to roll that out and what kind of challenges you foresee in making that happen?
So there's several different types of medical education. One of those is sponsored by industry. And what industry generally likes to do is transmit in, I'll describe them as annual meetings, association meetings, like the American College of Cardiology, what have you. And they'll transmit live procedures to those meetings. And there'll be 2,000 or 3,000 people in a room that are watching a procedure, and there's a panel of experts that are talking through the procedure and interacting live with a physician in the room. That's done with camera crews, with satellite dishes on top of trucks outside of hospitals and whatnot. Our technology obviates the need for the camera crews, obviates the need for the satellite trucks. We can actually transmit live procedures daily. In fact, we do as a fundamental business model. In order to translate that into medical education, what we've done is begun a platform where we would ask what are called key opinion leaders or thought leader physicians to use our system in live procedures and moderate one another's discussions in many respects, and moderate one another's procedures, much like would happen at the annual association meeting. Instead of doing it annually, we want to do it weekly, arguably daily, across clinical specialties. That is a fundamental way of disseminating clinical technology, clinical techniques and educating. There are many other ways, including a few of our university hospital customers have interest in putting our units in operating rooms so that they can expose physicians who are training to be surgeons to procedures that they might not otherwise be able to physically go into. Operating rooms are not enormous, and there might be a class of 15 or 20 surgeons who are in training. You can't fit them all in an operating room in a way that is useful for them to be able to see a procedure. So you'd only be able to put 2 or 3 in the operating room. With one of our systems, you can transmit from the operating room to a lecture hall or a small auditorium and run essentially that live case demonstration model I had described for an association meeting, but do it at a medical school. We in fact have a couple of medical school customers that are revamping their curriculum to make exactly that happen.
Oh, okay. And going back to the privacy question, are there any additional privacy concerns that arise when it comes to bringing this to using it in education in this way?
So there's a model within the industry that is tried and true. It's a highway that is well traveled, where before you transmit in a medical education type setting, you consent the patient. There's a dialogue to the patient describing exactly what's happening. And if they opt out, they opt out. If they opt in, then there's consent forms associated with that. And all the folks involved have to execute the consent form. So we essentially have permission at that point. There's no patient health information or private health information, what's known as PHI, transmitted. The name of the patient's never transmitted, or discussed. The age, date of birth, any of those sorts of things are never discussed. It is simply characteristics of the patient. In other words, age, gender, what type of clinical presentation they have, and then they go right into the case.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
So we would do the same.
Yeah. So just adopting an existing model for
yes, exactly.
And right. And so in terms of the technology itself, like what is stopping a tech company like Apple, for example, which has been expanding into healthcare, or telemedicine companies like Teladoc from developing their own form of procedural medicine? Like how does Avail plan to stay competitive?
So one of the things that is really important to understand in this is, yes, it's a piece of hardware. You can look at the hardware and say, well, it looks like other telemedicine carts and the like. There's some things about it that are different and specific to what we call procedural telemedicine. What it really is at the end of the day is the software, the user experience, and the capabilities. Without going into excruciating detail on it, when you're in a procedure room and you're supporting a case, there's a lot of things you need to be able to do. And I personally supported a couple of hundred procedures, from robotic procedures to angioplasties and others. And when you're in the room, there's interactions that you need to be able to have. There's information that you need to be able to see. We've created software that enables all of that to occur remotely. There aren't any other technologies on the market today that can do that. Sure, could theoretically somebody catch up? Yes, theoretically somebody could. Interesting thing happens though. When you give a hospital a piece of hardware and it's in the hospital, and then somebody else comes along with another piece of hardware they're charging for, it tends to be kind of sticky that you've got one that's in the hospital already.
Right.
The other advantage here, Diana, that's important to understand is the network itself feeds the network. So as we go from dozens and dozens and dozens of systems to hundreds and hundreds to thousands and thousands, a standard very quickly emerges. We have demand that is very clearly going to take us into the hundreds and into the thousands very quickly. And we think in a speed that will be very hard for other folks to be able to compete with. We've got at this juncture probably 450 years worth of medical device experience, sales and marketing experience in the company. And that's informing all of the capability of our software. We think that lead's going to be tough for a standard med tech company to overcome. Standard tech company to overcome, because that's really the nuts and bolts of the daily life of educating on procedures, commercializing technologies, and supporting physicians using technologies. That's the reason why we think we have a competitive edge, and we've got many, many, many things in the pipeline that are going to completely blow away what we have today.
All right. Well, we only have a few seconds left before the 2-minute mark, but just to end, can you talk a little bit about, a lot of the interest in telemedicine has been driven by the pandemic. How do you plan to keep that interest high once people can go back to being in person safely?
So the pandemic has certainly driven a great deal of focus on what we're doing because of the limitations on access. But what it's really done is put a very bright spotlight on a fundamental issue. That issue is that in order to launch procedures, in order to educate from physician to physician, in order to support physicians during procedures as a medical device industry, you have to be in the room. That's a 40-year-old problem, Diana, 40 years worth of that. And having run medical device technology companies, I can tell you it's haltingly difficult to overcome. Mm-hmm. We actually designed this technology and started this company to alleviate that issue. The pandemic put a white hot spotlight on this topic, but when the pandemic is resolved, hopefully sooner rather than later, the issue still remains. I would actually argue that the pandemic and the use of digital technology has reduced the adoption of what we're doing by probably 4 to 5 years worth of natural market development, because everybody's now used to being remote. I would actually argue that the future is very bright for remote procedure support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for the last 2 minutes of the conversation, we're going to play a little game called Overrated, Underrated, and how this works.
Okay.
Is I'm going to share with you a few terms, and you can tell me whether or not the thing is overrated or underrated, and explain briefly why you think that way. So the first thing is AI in telemedicine.
I would say it is underrated. There's a lot of hype about it, but I don't think many appreciate the opportunity for AI to be able to impact real-time procedural decisions. Our future includes AI as applications, because we think that there's a terrific opportunity to do that real-time using our system.
Okay. The second thing is Apple in healthcare.
Unfortunately, overrated. So I would say from the standpoint of population health, underrated. From the standpoint of procedural healthcare, massively overrated. Fantastic opportunities to be able to assess heart rate and blood pressure using an Apple Watch. Great for population, challenging to transfer that to procedural healthcare.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing is Teladoc.
Underrated. So there's a lot of hype associated with Teladoc. I think it's deserved. I actually believe that telemedicine has come of age, and come of age in a manner that is never going to change. You might see less press-related hype on telemedicine, but the very notion, anybody who has children or anybody who has had to leave work to go to a doctor's appointment, if you can go into a conference room and have a doctor's appointment over Teladoc, that's a great deal better than having to hop in your car and somehow manage your email and phone calls while you're driving to be able to get to an appointment, to wait in a procedure room. I actually think that telemedicine is here to stay, and Teladoc is absolutely going to be a front runner.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. It was a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.